The forest has rules. No one told me. All of them. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a superstitious person. I have never believed in ghosts or curses or any of the things people talk about around campfires to make themselves feel alive. I studied environmental science at a mid-tier state university. I graduated with a 3.2 GPA and $40,000 in student loans, and I took this job because it was the only offer I received that included housing. That's it. That's the entire reason I ended up at the Caldwell Lake Forest Reserve in the northwest corner of a state I will not name, because I signed paperwork that I now believe was more binding than I understood at the time. The position was listed as a seasonal monitoring technician. 6 months, mid-April through mid-October, stationed at one of the reserve's 4 outposts, collecting data on water quality, soil erosion, and canopy coverage within a designated survey grid. The listing described the location as remote, which I expected, and the work as independent, which I preferred. I had done 2 previous seasonal stints with the Forest Service, one in Utah and one in the Southern Cascades, so I understood what isolation meant. I understood what it meant to not see another person for 9 or 10 days at a time. I was comfortable with that. What I was not comfortable with, and what I did not fully understand until I had been at the outpost for nearly 3 weeks, was that the job as described and the job as it actually existed were not the same thing. I arrived on April 14th. A man named Dahl drove me in from the reserve's main administrative station, which was itself a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. Dahl was in his late 50s, possibly older. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been left outside for decades, which I suppose it had. He was not unfriendly, but he didn't talk much during the drive. When he did, it was about practical things, where the water pump was, how to operate the propane system, which radio frequency to use for weekly check-ins, and when those check-ins were expected. It was during this drive that he gave me the rules. He did not call them rules at first. He called them protocols. He pulled a single laminated sheet from the glove compartment and handed it to me without looking away from the road. The sheet was pale green, slightly scratched, with text printed in a clean sans serif font. No header, no logo, no date. Just a numbered list. There were 9 items. I will reproduce them here as closely as I can remember, because I no longer have the original sheet, and I will explain why later. 1. Weekly check-ins are conducted on Sundays at 0800 via Channel 4. Do not use Channel 4 at any other time. 2. Survey routes must be completed between 0600 and 1400. Do not begin a route before 0600. Do not continue a route after 1400. 3. Outpost lights must be turned off no later than 2200. 4. Do not leave food outside the outpost structure. 5. If you encounter a trail marker that is not on your survey map, do not follow it. 6. Do not approach the lake between sundown and sunrise. 7. If you hear knocking at the outpost door between 2200 and 0500, do not open it. 8. Maintain a distance of at least 15 meters from any standing dead tree with black bark. 9. If you find a written note or message that you did not write, do not read it aloud. I read them in the truck. I read them again. I looked at Dahl and asked him what number 6 was about. He said the shoreline was unstable in the dark, and there had been incidents. I asked about number 7. He said animals sometimes investigated the structures at night, and it was best not to encourage contact. I asked about number 8. He said the black bark trees were a species prone to sudden collapse, and the 15-meter buffer was a safety standard. I did not ask about number 9. At the time, I assumed it was some kind of holdover from a previous version of the protocols, maybe related to contamination of survey notes, or maybe it was a joke. Seasonal workers sometimes inherited odd traditions from previous crews. I had seen stranger things on laminated sheets in government-adjacent jobs. Dahl dropped me off at Outpost C around 2 in the afternoon. The structure was a single-room cabin, roughly 12 by 16 feet, with a cot, a desk, a propane stove, a storage locker, and a radio unit mounted to the wall. There was a small window on each of the 4 walls. The door faced south. There was a composting toilet in a separate shed about 20 feet from the main structure. The surrounding area had been cleared in a rough circle, maybe 40 feet in diameter, and beyond that, the trees began immediately and thickly. Douglas fir, western red cedar, and something else I could not immediately identify. A pale, smooth-barked species that didn't match anything in my reference materials. I made a note to look it up later. I never did find a match. Dahl showed me the water pump, the propane tank, the equipment locker where the survey tools were stored. He pointed south and told me the lake was about a 12-minute walk on the main path. He pointed northwest and said Outpost B was roughly 4 miles through the forest, though there was no direct trail and I should not attempt to reach it on foot. He told me the supply truck would come every 2 weeks on alternating Wednesdays. He told me my first check-in would be the following Sunday. Then he got back in the truck and drove away, and I stood in the clearing and listened to the engine sound fade until there was nothing left but the forest. I want to describe what that silence was like, but I'm not sure I can do it accurately. It was not the absence of sound. There were birds. There was wind in the upper canopy. There was the occasional crack of a branch settling somewhere in the mid-distance. But beneath all of that, there was a quality to the quiet that I had not experienced before. Not in Utah, not in the Cascades, not anywhere. It felt dense. It felt like the silence had weight, like it was pressing inward from every direction at once. I attributed this to the thickness of the forest and the lack of any open sky except the small circle above the clearing. Sound behaves differently in enclosed spaces. I knew that. The first week was uneventful. I followed the survey routes on my map, 6 of them in total, each covering a different section of my assigned grid. The routes were well marked with small aluminum tags nailed to trees at regular intervals. The work was straightforward. I collected water samples from 3 streams. I measured soil compaction at designated points. I photographed canopy coverage using a fisheye lens pointed straight up. I recorded everything in a logbook and transferred the data to a set of standardized forms that I would leave in the equipment locker for the supply truck to collect. I followed the rules. I did my check-in on Sunday at 800. A woman's voice acknowledged my report and asked if I had any concerns. I said no. The transmission ended. I turned off my lights at 2200. I did not go near the lake after dark. I did not follow any unmarked trails, though I did not encounter any during that first week. I stayed away from the blackbark trees, of which there were several along my routes, mostly standing alone, leafless, dark as iron. Their bark cracked in vertical fissures that looked almost deliberate, almost like something had drawn lines down their trunks with a blade. I felt safe. That is important to say. During that first week, I felt safe. The rules made sense. The work was clear. The forest was dense and quiet, but it was a forest, and I had worked in forests before. I slept well. I ate my meals on schedule. I felt, if anything, a mild satisfaction at the simplicity of the arrangement. The first thing that changed was small. On the morning of April 22nd, my 8th day at the outpost, I was walking Route 3, which ran roughly east from the cabin for about 1.5 miles before curving north toward a ridgeline. About 40 minutes into the walk, I came across a trail marker that was not on my map. It was identical to the others, a small aluminum tag nailed to a tree at eye height, with a number stamped into it. The number was 1. This would not have been unusual, except that Route 3's markers began at 14 and ended at 27. There was no marker 1 on Route 3. I checked my map. There was no marker 1 on any of the 6 routes. The numbering on each route began at a different value. Route 1 started at 8. Route 2 started at 11. There was no marker numbered 1 anywhere in my assigned grid. I remembered Rule 5. If you encounter a trail marker that is not on your survey map, do not follow it. I did not follow it. I noted its position in my logbook, approximately 600 meters east-southeast of the outpost, on the south side of a large cedar, and I continued on my route. But I thought about it for the rest of the day, and the thing I thought about was not the marker itself, but the phrasing of the rule. The rule did not say, report any unmarked trail markers. It did not say, these markers are from an old survey system and should be ignored. It said, do not follow it. The language was directive. It assumed you might want to follow it, or that something about it would compel you to follow it. That specificity bothered me in a way I could not articulate at the time. On April 24th, I found a second unmarked marker. This one was on Route 5, in a part of the forest I had already walked 3 times. It was nailed to an alder tree about 200 meters from the lake at exactly eye height, just like the others. The number stamped into it was 1. The same number, on a different route, in a different part of the forest. I stood in front of it for a long time. I touched it. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been for the ambient temperature, which was about 50 degrees. I noted the position in my logbook and moved on. That night, I lay on my cot and listened to the forest. It was 21:30. The lights were still on. I could hear wind and the usual settling sounds and something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping that I initially took for a woodpecker, but it was too regular, too evenly spaced. It went on for about 10 minutes and then stopped. I checked the time when it stopped. It was 21:47. On Sunday, April 26th, I did my check-in. I reported the 2 unmarked markers and gave their coordinates. The woman's voice, the same one as before, said, "Thank you," and asked if I had any concerns. I said no, but I wanted to say yes. I wanted to ask about the markers, about the rules, about why the numbering on the survey routes was so inconsistent. I didn't, because the check-in format did not seem to invite extended conversation, and because I was not sure what I would even ask. The supply truck came on April 29th. I was on a route at the time and did not see the driver. When I returned to the outpost at 13:20, I found 2 boxes of supplies on the ground near the door. Standard provisions, canned food, batteries, water purification tablets, a new logbook. I also found, tucked between the boxes, a second laminated sheet. It was the same pale green color, the same font, the same format. But it was not the same list. It was a continuation. 10. Do not mark or alter any trees within the survey grid. 11. If the lake is visible from a point where it should not be visible according to topographic data, leave the area immediately and do not return to that point for at least 48 hours. 12. Do not attempt to count the black bark trees. I read this sheet 3 times. Then I put it on the desk next to the original sheet and looked at them side by side. The font was identical. The color was identical. The paper stock, the lamination, the slight rounded corners, all identical. These had been produced at the same time by the same process as a set. But Dahl had only given me the first sheet. I want to be precise about what I felt at that moment, because it was not fear. It was a kind of cold, structural anger. The feeling you get when you realize that someone has withheld information from you, not by accident, but by design. The protocols were not complete. They had never been complete. The sheet Dahl gave me in the truck was a partial list, and he either knew that and chose not to tell me, or he did not know, which meant someone had decided, above him, that I would receive the rules in stages. Rule 12 unsettled me the most. Do not attempt to count the black bark trees. I had not attempted to count them, but I had noticed them. They were hard to miss. They were the only trees in the forest that appeared to be completely dead, leafless, black, standing among the green like burned pillars. I had registered them passively, the way you register any repeated feature in a landscape. There were several along Route 3, a few near the lake, some at the edges of my grid. I had not counted them, but I could have. I might have, eventually, out of idle curiosity. And now, I was being told not to. The question, of course, was why. What happens if you count them? The rule did not say. None of the rules said what would happen if you broke them. They were all imperatives without consequences. Do not do this. Do not do that. The silence around the reasons felt intentional, like the gap between the first sheet and the second. I followed the new rules. I did not mark any trees. I did not try to count the blackbark trees, though I became acutely aware of them in a way I had not been before. It's a particular kind of psychological torture, being told not to notice something. The instruction itself forces the noticing. Every time I walked a route and saw one of those dark, fissured trunks standing in the green, I felt a small involuntary pulse of attention, a quick mental tally that I had to consciously suppress. I began to understand that the rule was not really about counting. It was about the relationship between my attention and those trees. The rule wanted me to look away. May began. The weather warmed slightly. The days grew longer. I adjusted my schedule to account for the earlier sunrises and continued my routes without incident. My logbook filled with data, soil pH values, canopy percentages, stream turbidity readings, normal numbers, clean data. The work was real. I want to emphasize that. Whatever else was happening, the work was real. I was collecting genuine scientific data according to genuine methodologies. The forest was a forest. The trees were trees. The water was water. I held on to that. On May 3rd, something happened that I still cannot explain. I was on Route 1, which ran north from the outpost into a steep, heavily wooded drainage. The route was about 2 miles round trip, and I usually completed it in about 90 minutes. On this day, I reached marker 15, which was the turnaround point, at 08:47. I checked my watch, noted the time, and began walking back. The return trip should have taken approximately 45 minutes. When I reached the outpost, I checked my watch again. It was 11:34. 2 hours and 47 minutes for a 45-minute walk on a trail I knew well, at a pace that had not varied, with no stops. I sat on the step outside the cabin and tried to account for the time. I went through the walk in my memory, step by step. I had not stopped. I had not detoured. I had not lost the trail. I had walked back the same way I came, marker by marker, and each marker had appeared at the expected interval. But the total time was wrong by 2 hours. I considered the possibility that my watch was malfunctioning. I checked it against the clock on the radio unit. They matched. Both read 11:34. I considered the possibility that I had misread the time at marker 15, but I had written it in my logbook. 08:47. The ink was there, in my handwriting, on the page. I did not report this during my next check-in. I'm not sure why. Partly because I could not explain it, and partly because I had begun to develop a feeling, not a thought, but a feeling, that the check-ins were not for my benefit, that the information flowed in one direction, and the concern flowed in no direction at all. On May 7th, I found the third laminated sheet. This one was not left with supplies. It was inside my outpost on the desk when I returned from Route 4 at 13:07. I had locked the door when I left that morning. The door was still locked when I returned. The windows were intact. There was no sign of entry. The sheet was centered on the desk, perfectly aligned with the edges. 13. If you observe a light in the forest between 2200 and 500, do not look at it for more than 4 seconds. 14. The lake's water level will change. Do not attempt to measure or record these changes. 15. If you find yourself on a route that does not match your map, stop walking, close your eyes, and wait. When you open your eyes, you will be on the correct route. Do not open your eyes early. 16. There is no Outpost D. If you see a structure that appears to be Outpost D, do not approach it. I need to stop here and describe what I felt when I read Rule 16, because it was the moment the ground shifted under me. When Dahl drove me in on April 14th, he told me the reserve had 4 outposts. 4. A, B, C, and D. Outpost C was mine. He had referred to D in passing. He said it was southeast, about 6 miles, staffed by a technician named Pruitt who had been with the reserve for 3 seasons. He mentioned Pruitt's name casually, the way you mention a neighbor. I had not thought about Outpost D or Pruitt since that conversation. They had existed in my mind as simple facts, background details in the architecture of my situation. And now a laminated sheet, produced in the same format and by the same process as the others, was telling me there was no Outpost D. I tried to reconcile this. Maybe Outpost D had been decommissioned between the time Dahl briefed me and the time this sheet was produced. Maybe Pruitt had been reassigned. Maybe D existed in some administrative sense, but was no longer a physical structure. But the phrasing did not support any of these readings. It did not say Outpost D has been closed or Outpost D is no longer in use. It said there is no Outpost D. Present tense. Definitional. As if it had never existed. And then the second clause. If you see a structure that appears to be Outpost D, which meant something was out there that looked like it, something that could be seen and mistaken for a place that, according to this rule, did not exist. I sat at the desk for a long time. The 3 laminated sheets were lined up in front of me. 9 rules, then 3, then 4. 16 total. And I understood, in a way that I could feel in my chest like a slow pressure, that there were more, that the numbering was not going to stop, that the system was being fed to me piece by piece, just fast enough to keep me compliant, just slow enough to keep me from seeing its full shape. I started writing the rules down in the back of my logbook. I wanted them in one place. I wanted to see them together, as a whole document, rather than as fragments on separate sheets. I thought that if I could see the pattern, I could understand the logic, and if I could understand the logic, I could predict what was coming. This was a mistake. Not because anything happened immediately, but because the act of compiling the rules forced me to read them closely, to compare their language, to look for internal structure, and what I found was that they did not form a coherent system. They contradicted each other. Not obviously, not in ways that would be apparent on a first reading, but in ways that emerged when you tried to follow all of them simultaneously. For example, Rule 2 said survey routes must be completed between 0600 and 1400. Rule 11 said if the lake is visible from a point where it should not be visible, leave the area immediately. But Route 5 ran near the lake, and there were points on Route 5 where the lake was intermittently visible through the trees, depending on the light and the angle. On some days, the lake seemed visible from positions where, according to my topographic map, the ridgeline should have blocked the view entirely. If I followed Rule 11, I would have to abandon Route 5 mid-survey. But if I abandoned Route 5 mid-survey, I would be failing to complete my route within the designated time frame, which would violate the spirit if not the letter of Rule 2. Another example. Rule 5 said, do not follow unmarked trail markers. But Rule 15 said if you find yourself on a route that does not match your map, stop walking, close your eyes, and wait. What if an unmarked trail marker appeared on what I believed to be my assigned route? Was the route wrong, or was the marker wrong? Did the presence of an anomalous marker mean I was already on the wrong route? And if so, should I follow Rule 5 and ignore the marker, or follow Rule 15 and close my eyes? These contradictions were not accidental. I became more certain of that with each day. The rules had been written by someone who knew they would conflict. The conflicts were part of the design. On May 10th, I did something I had been avoiding. I walked to the lake during the day, and I looked at it carefully. The lake was roughly oval, maybe 300 meters across at its widest point, surrounded by dense forest that came down to the waterline on all sides except the south, where there was a narrow strip of gravel shore. The water was dark. Not murky, not polluted, just dark, in the way that very deep water is dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. There was no visible current, no inlet that I could find, no outlet. The surface was still, perfectly still, even when wind moved through the trees around it. I stood on the gravel shore for about 20 minutes. During that time, I watched the water level. There were faint mineral lines on the rocks at the waterline, the kind of markings left by changing water levels over time. But the lines did not form a consistent pattern. Some rocks showed high water marks nearly a foot above the current surface. Others, rocks that were right next to them, showed no marks at all, as if the water had never reached them, even though they were at the same elevation. I remembered Rule 14. The lake's water level will change. Do not attempt to measure or record these changes. I was not measuring. I was observing. But I understood that the distinction might not matter to whoever had written the rule. I left the lake and walked back to the outpost. The walk should have taken 12 minutes. It took 12 minutes. I was almost disappointed. On the night of May 12th, I saw the light. I was in my cot. It was 22:38. The outpost lights were off, had been since 2200 per the rule. I was not asleep. I was lying on my back looking at the ceiling, which was low enough that I could see the grain of the wood in the faint ambient glow from the window. Then the glow changed. It brightened slightly on the north wall. I turned my head toward the north window. There was a light in the forest. It was not a flashlight. It was not a fire. It was a pale, steady, diffuse glow, roughly the color of overcast daylight, positioned somewhere in the trees about 200 meters north of the outpost. It did not move. It did not pulse. It was simply there, as if someone had placed a lamp behind a sheet of white fabric and hung it between the trunks. Rule 13. If you observe a light in the forest between 2,200 and 500, do not look at it for more than 4 seconds. I looked away. I counted to 10. I looked back. The light was still there. I looked away again after 3 seconds. My heart was beating fast, and I want to be honest about that. Whatever calm I had cultivated over the previous 4 weeks was gone. I was frightened, not because the light was inherently terrifying, but because the rule existed. The rule predated the light. Someone had seen this before, and instead of explaining it, they had written a rule about how long you were allowed to look at it. 4 seconds. Why 4? Not 3, not 5. 4 seconds. The specificity implied knowledge. It implied that someone had determined, through observation or experience, that 4 seconds was the threshold, that looking for 5 seconds, or 6, or 10, produced a result that was different from looking for 4. And whatever that result was, it was bad enough to codify a rule about it, but not bad enough, or not describable enough, to explain. The light stayed for approximately 40 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when I first saw it, and I checked again when the glow on the north wall faded. During those 40 minutes, I did not sleep. I lay in my cot, and I looked at the ceiling, and I breathed slowly, and I followed the rule. In the morning, I walked north to where the light had been. I found nothing. No scorched ground, no trampled vegetation, no equipment, no evidence of any kind. The forest was dense and green and silent. I stood in the approximate location where the light source should have been, and I turned in a circle, looking for anything out of place. There was nothing, except that the bird sounds, which had been present when I left the outpost, were absent here. I stood in that silence for a few minutes, and then I walked back. The supply truck came on May 13th. Again, I was on a route and did not see the driver. Again, there were 2 boxes of supplies. Again, tucked between them, a new laminated sheet, 17. Do not speak aloud between 2200 and 0500 unless transmitting on the radio. 18. If you encounter another person in the forest who is not associated with the reserve, do not engage in conversation. Return to your outpost immediately. 19. Do not draw, sketch, or create any visual representation of the lake. 20. If your logbook contains entries you do not remember writing, do not attempt to erase or alter them. Continue logging on the next blank page. Rule 20 stopped me. I put the sheet down and picked up my logbook and went through it, page by page, entry by entry, reading every line. It was all mine. Every entry was in my handwriting. Every data point matched my memory. There were no anomalous entries. But now I would be checking. Every day, every time I opened the logbook, I would be checking. And the act of checking would mean that I believed it was possible. The rule had introduced the possibility into my mind, and now it was there, and it could not be removed. I began to see the rules differently after that, not as protections, not as safety protocols, but as something else, as conditioning. Each rule, whether I followed it or broke it, changed my behavior. Each rule directed my attention, shaped my awareness, altered the way I moved through the forest. Do not count the black bark trees. Now I notice them constantly. Do not look at the light for more than 4 seconds. Now I measured every glance. Do not draw the lake. Now I thought about the lake's shape obsessively, holding it in my mind, unable to externalize it, unable to release it. The rules were not protecting me from the forest. The rules were changing the way I existed inside the forest. On May 16th, I deviated from protocol for the first time. I left the outpost at 0430, 90 minutes before the earliest permitted start time for a survey route. I did not go on a route. I walked south toward the lake. It was still dark, technically before sunrise, and Rule 6 said I should not approach the lake between sundown and sunrise. I approached it anyway. The forest at that hour was different. Not dangerous, not threatening, just different. The quality of the air had changed. It was thicker, warmer than it should have been for the pre-dawn temperature, and it carried a smell that I had not noticed during my daytime visits. Not decay, not vegetation, but something mineral and faintly metallic, like wet stone or old copper. The trees seemed closer together, though I knew this was a perceptual effect of the low light. The path to the lake, which I had walked many times and knew to be straight, felt longer than usual. Not dramatically longer, maybe 30% longer. I counted my steps. It took 1,140 steps to reach the gravel shore. During the day, it usually took about 870. The lake was there. The water was there. But the surface was not still. It was moving. Not with waves or current, but with a slow lateral displacement, as if the entire body of water was shifting to the left toward the eastern shore by an inch or two every few seconds. I watched it. I timed it. Every 3 seconds, the waterline on the western shore receded by approximately 1 centimeter, and the waterline on the eastern shore advanced by the same amount. The lake was moving sideways, uniformly, like a tray of water being carried by someone walking. I watched for about 6 minutes. Then the movement stopped. The surface went still, and in the stillness I saw, or I think I saw, something on the far side of the lake. A structure. Square, dark, set back from the opposite shore by maybe 50 feet. It had the dimensions of an outpost. I could see a straight roof line and the faint rectangle of a window. The far side of the lake was south-southeast from where I stood. Outpost D, if it existed, would have been southeast. There is no Outpost D. If you see a structure that appears to be Outpost D, do not approach it. I did not approach it. I turned around and walked back to the outpost. The return trip took 871 steps. The path was the right length again. The air was thin and cold. The next Sunday, May 18th, I did my check-in at 800. I gave my standard report. Then I asked a question. I said, I have received multiple supplementary protocol sheets. Can you confirm the total number of protocols in the current system? There was a pause, longer than usual. Then the woman's voice said, Thank you for your report. Check-in complete. The transmission ended. I sat with the radio for a few minutes, thinking about pressing the transmit button again, asking again, demanding an answer. But Rule 1 said do not use Channel 4 at any other time, and I'd begun to follow the rules, not because I believed they were right, but because I was afraid of what would fill the space if I stopped. On May 21st, I found entries in my logbook that I did not remember writing. They were on page 47. My most recent entry was on page 46, dated May 20th, a standard Route 2 data log. Page 47 should have been blank. It was not blank. It was filled top to bottom in handwriting that was mine. I know my own handwriting. I have written thousands of pages in logbooks over the years. The slant, the size, the way I form my sevens with a cross through the stem, it was all consistent. It was my hand. But I had not written it. The entries were not data. They were not survey measurements or coordinates or any of the standard fields. They were a list. A numbered list, starting at 21 and ending at 34. 14 new rules, written in the same flat, imperative style as the laminated sheets. I will not reproduce all of them here. Some of them I have tried to forget, and I have succeeded with a few, which is its own kind of disturbing. The idea that knowledge can be lost by an act of will, or that whatever is happening to me includes the ability to let things go. But I will reproduce some of them, the ones that I carried with me for the remainder of my time at the outpost, the ones that mattered. 22. If you find yourself thinking about a rule you have not been given, you have already been given it. 26. The forest contains 4 outposts. You are in 1. 2 are occupied. 1 is not an outpost. 28. If you stop following the rules, you will not be punished. You will be incorporated. 30. Do not look for the boundaries of the reserve. The reserve does not have boundaries. 33. You were not the first technician assigned to Outpost C this season. Rule 20 said if my logbook contained entries I did not remember writing, I should not attempt to erase or alter them. I should continue logging on the next blank page. I followed the rule. I turned to page 48 and continued my work. but my hands were shaking, and my handwriting on page 48 is noticeably unsteady, and I know this because I looked at it many times in the days that followed, comparing it to the handwriting on page 47, looking for differences and finding none. I want to talk about Rule 28. If you stop following the rules, you will not be punished. You will be incorporated. I have thought about this sentence more than any other, and I have not reached a conclusion about what it means. But I have reached several conclusions about what it feels like. It feels like a description of a process that is already underway. It feels like a distinction between two states, punishment and incorporation, that I do not fully understand, but that I instinctively recognize as different in a way that matters enormously. Punishment implies an external force acting upon you. Incorporation implies absorption, becoming part of something, losing the boundary between yourself and something else. I began to wonder if the forest was the system, or if the forest was inside the system, or if I was inside the forest inside the system, or if these layers did not have the clear borders I wanted them to have. Rule 30 said the reserve does not have boundaries. I had assumed the reserve was a defined geographic area, delineated on a map somewhere, registered with a land management agency, bounded by coordinates. But what if it was not? What if the reserve was defined not by its edges, but by its rules, and the rules extended as far as they were followed, and they were being followed by me right now, in this cabin, on this cot, in this forest, that I could not leave because I did not know where it ended. I need to describe what happened on May 23rd, and I need to be as precise as I can, because it was the last day I was fully sure of the order of events. I was on Route 6. This was the longest route, roughly 3 miles round trip, running southwest from the outpost into a drainage that I had walked 11 times previously. The route was familiar. The markers were in place. The forest was green, the canopy thick, the understory sparse in the way it always was on Route 6, with open ground between the trunks and a deep layer of duff that silenced my footsteps. At marker 39, about halfway through the route, I stopped to take a soil sample. I knelt down, pushed the corer into the ground, extracted the sample, and bagged it. Standard procedure. When I stood up and looked at the tree in front of me, the marker was gone, not fallen, not obscured, gone. The nail was still in the tree. The small hole where the tag had hung was visible, but the tag was not there. I looked at the ground around the base of the tree. I looked in the undergrowth. I widened my search to a 10-meter radius. Nothing. I looked at my map. Marker 39 should have been right here, on the north side of a large cedar, and the cedar was here, and the nail was here, but the marker was not. I continued along the route. Marker 40 was in place. Marker 41 was in place. The rest of the route was normal. I completed it, returned to the outpost at 12:56, and sat at the desk and opened my logbook. Page 48, where I had written my Route 6 data that morning, was no longer the most recent page with writing on it. Page 49 had writing on it. My handwriting again. A single line. Marker 39 is where you will understand. I closed the logbook. I did not open it again for 2 days. During those 2 days, I stayed in the outpost. I did not complete any survey routes. I ate sparingly. I slept in short bursts, waking each time to check the windows, to check the door, to listen. The forest outside was exactly as it had always been. Green, dense, quiet. Birds in the canopy, wind in the upper branches, the weighted silence beneath everything. On the second night, May 24th, at approximately 2300, I heard knocking at the door. Rule 7. If you hear knocking at the outpost door between 2200 and 0500, do not open it. I did not open it. I lay in my cot and listened. The knocking was steady. 3 knocks, A pause of about 4 seconds, 3 knocks, a pause. Not frantic, not aggressive. Patient. It sounded, and I do not say this lightly, exactly like a person knocking. The weight, the spacing, the sound of knuckles on wood. It was not an animal. I have heard animals investigate structures, and they do not knock in groups of 3 with 4-second intervals. Whatever was at the door was either a person or something that understood the pattern of human knocking. It continued for 1 hour and 14 minutes. I timed it. I lay in the dark and listened to every knock, and I timed the intervals, and they were consistent, almost exactly 4 seconds each time, with a variance of less than half a second. Then it stopped. The forest was quiet. I did not sleep. In the morning, I opened the door and looked at the ground outside. There were no footprints. The clearing around the outpost was covered in a thin layer of duff and dried needles, and it was undisturbed. I looked at the door. The wood where the knocking had struck was slightly lighter in color than the surrounding surface, as if it had been worn or abraded. But this could have been my imagination, or it could have been a feature I had simply never noticed before. I went back inside and opened the logbook. There was a new entry on the next page in my handwriting. 35. The knocking is not a test. The knocking is an invitation. You may accept it at any time. Once accepted, it will not come again. I went back to my roots on May 26th. I do not know exactly why. Maybe because the work was the only thing that still made sense. The data was real. The samples were real. The trees and the soil and the water were real. Or they behaved as if they were real, which at that point was the only standard I had left. Route 3. I walked east from the outpost into the forest. The markers were all in place. The route matched my map. I collected my data. I reached the turnaround point at marker 27 and began the return. Everything was normal. The forest was quiet. The canopy was thick. The light was green and filtered. At approximately the position where I had found the first unmarked marker, the one numbered 1, on April 22nd, I stopped. There was something different. Not visually. The trees were the same. The light was the same. The path was the same. But there was a quality in the air that I can only describe as a kind of attention. A feeling that the space around me was not passive, but active. That it was oriented. Directed. The way a room feels different when someone is watching you from a doorway, except there was no doorway and there was no one. There was only the forest, and the forest was paying attention. I stood very still. I breathed. I looked at the trees. I looked at the ground. I looked up. The canopy above me was different, not dramatically. The arrangement of branches was slightly altered from what I had seen on previous walks. One branch that I specifically remembered, a large lateral limb on a cedar about 30 feet up, was not there. In its place was a gap, an opening in the canopy that allowed a column of direct light to fall on the exact spot where I was standing. I moved out of the light. The feeling of attention decreased. I stepped back into it. The feeling returned. I thought about marker 39. Marker 39 is where you will understand. But I was not at marker 39. I was on a different route, at a different point, unless the locations corresponded to something other than their positions on my map. Unless the numbering meant something I had not grasped. Do not attempt to count the black bark trees. I looked around me. There were 3 black bark trees visible from where I stood. I did not count them. Or rather, I did count them involuntarily in the automatic way that a human mind inventories its surroundings. 3. The number is in my mind before I could stop it. I looked away, looked back. 3. They stood at roughly equal distances from each other, forming a triangle, and I was standing approximately at its center. I left. I walked back to the outpost. I did not run. I want to be clear about that. I did not run because running would have meant I was afraid. And if I was afraid, then something was wrong. And if something was wrong, then the rules were not enough. And if the rules were not enough, then I was not safe. And I needed to be safe. I needed the rules to be enough. I needed the system to work, even though I knew it did not work. Because the alternative was an openness, a boundarylessness that I could not survive. I am going to describe the last 10 days now, and I am going to do it quickly, because the details are becoming less reliable in my memory, and I want to get them down while I still trust them. May 27th through May 30th. I completed my routes on schedule. The data was normal. The forest was normal. No new laminated sheets, no new logbook entries. The knocking did not return. The light did not return. I began to feel, cautiously, that whatever cycle I was in had paused or reset. I did my check-in on Sunday, June 1st. The woman's voice was the same. The format was the same. I gave my report. She said, "Thank you. Check-in complete." I almost felt normal. June 2nd, Route 4. At marker 22, I found a note. It was a piece of paper, standard line notebook paper, folded twice and wedged into a crack in the bark of an alder tree, about 5 feet off the ground. I extracted it carefully. I unfolded it. It was handwritten, but not in my handwriting. The script was tight, small, angular, difficult to read. I brought it close to my face and read it silently, because Rule 9 said, if you find a written note or message that you did not write, do not read it aloud. The note said, "My name is Pruitt. I was assigned to Outpost D. I have been here for 2 years. The season does not end. The supply truck is not real. The check-ins are recordings. I have found 67 rules. There are more. I don't think the rules come from outside the forest. I think the forest is writing them. I think we are the ones being studied. Don't count the trees. Don't count the trees. Don't count them." The last line was written 5 more times, each iteration slightly larger and more erratic than the last, trailing off the bottom of the page. I folded the note. I put it in my pocket. I finished my route. I returned to the outpost at 1340. I sat at my desk, and I took the note out, and I read it again. Pruitt, Outpost D. There is no Outpost D, but Dahl had mentioned Pruitt. Dahl had said Pruitt was in his 3rd season. 3rd season. If the season does not end, what does that mean? How do you count seasons inside a system that does not have boundaries? If the supply truck is not real, then what left the boxes? If the check-ins are recordings, then who recorded them and when? And why do they respond to my reports with the correct phrasing? Unless they don't. Unless the responses are generic enough to fit any report. Thank you. Check-in complete. I went back through my memory of every Sunday check-in. The responses had always been the same. Always thank you. Always a question about whether I had concerns. Always check-in complete. I had never said anything that would have required a specific or individualized response. I had never tested it. I had never said something unexpected, something that demanded a real answer from a real person. I decided to test it the following Sunday. June 8th, 800. Channel 4. I gave my report, a short, standard summary of the week's data. Then, instead of signing off, I said, "My name is not the name you have on file. Can you confirm my name?" The pause was exactly the same length as always. "Thank you for your report," the voice said. "Do you have any concerns?" I said, "Yes. I am concerned that I do not know who I am speaking to." "Check-in complete," the voice said. The transmission ended. I sat with the radio and I waited. Nothing. I pressed the transmit button and said, "This is Outpost C, please respond." Nothing. I tried 3 more times. Nothing. Channel 4 was silent. I switched to other channels. Channels 1 through 3, 5 through 10. Nothing on any of them. Not even static. Just silence. The deep, weighted silence of the forest transmitted through a speaker. I put the radio down. In the days that followed, things accelerated, and I want to use that word carefully because the acceleration was not dramatic. It was gradual, cumulative, a slow increase in the density of wrongness until the wrongness was no longer the exception, but the medium. The thing I moved through. The routes began to change, not their positions on the map, not their marker sequences, but their character. Route 3, which had always run through dense, old-growth forest, began to pass through sections that felt younger, thinner, with smaller trees and more light. Route 1, which had always been steep, began to flatten. The distances between markers remained consistent, but the terrain between them shifted, sometimes between one visit and the next. I would walk a section of Route 5 through a stand of cedars on Monday, and walk the same section through bare alders on Wednesday. The markers were in the right places. The map was correct. But the forest between the markers was not the same forest. I started seeing the blackbark trees more frequently. I did not count them, but there were more of them. Or they were more visible. Or I was seeing the same ones from different angles that made them appear to be different trees in different locations. I could not tell. The rule said, do not attempt to count them, and I understood now that the rule was not a precaution, but a mercy, because counting them would have required me to distinguish between them, to individuate them, and I do not think they were individual. I think they were manifestations of a single thing, placed throughout the forest like fingers pushed up through the soil from below. On June 10th, I was walking Route 6 when I realized I had been walking for 3 hours. It was 1100. I had started at 0600. Route 6 was a 3-mile round trip that took, at most, 2 hours, but I had not yet reached the turnaround point. The markers kept appearing at regular intervals, correctly numbered, correctly spaced, but the route did not end. I passed marker 44, which should have been the last marker, and there was another one. 45, then 46, then 47. Markers that did not exist on any of my routes, in any of my maps. I stopped. I remembered Rule 15. If you find yourself on a route that does not match your map, stop walking, close your eyes, and wait. I closed my eyes. I stood in the forest with my eyes closed, and I waited. The silence pressed in. The air was warm and still. I could feel the light on my face, filtered through the canopy, shifting slightly as clouds moved or branches swayed. I waited. I don't know how long I waited. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the clearing outside my outpost. The cabin was in front of me. The door was open. I had closed it when I left that morning. I checked my watch. It was 13:42. I had no memory of walking back. I went inside. My logbook was open on the desk to a new page. There was a single entry in my handwriting. You are beginning to understand. I sat down. I read the sentence again, and I did understand something, though not in the way the sentence seemed to promise. What I understood was not an answer but a shape, a topology. I understood that the forest, the rules, the routes, the markers, the lake, the blackbark trees, the light, the knocking, the logbook, the laminated sheets, doll, Pruitt, the voice on the radio, the supply truck, all of it was a single thing. Not a collection of strange events, but a unified phenomenon. A structure. An environment that was organized not around the trees or the terrain, but around me. Around my attention, my behavior, my compliance, my fear. The rules were not rules for surviving the forest. The rules were the mechanism by which the forest operated on me. Each rule I followed changed me. Each rule I internalized shaped the way I perceived my surroundings. Do not look at the light for more than 4 seconds, and suddenly I was a person who measured the duration of every glance. Do not count the trees, and suddenly I was a person who fought against counting. Do not read notes aloud, and suddenly I was a person who carried silence inside me like a weight. The rules were not descriptions of danger. They were instructions for becoming a particular kind of inhabitant, a particular kind of component. Incorporated. That was the word. If you stop following the rules, you will not be punished. You will be incorporated. But the truth, the thing I understood standing in my cabin on June 10th, was that following the rules was also incorporation. Slower, more orderly, more gentle, but the same process, the same destination. The rules were not the alternative to incorporation. The rules were the method of incorporation. They were the teeth of the mechanism, and they had been turning since April 14th, and I had been moving through them voluntarily, carefully, obediently, and I had been changing, and I had not noticed because the changes were the kind that feel like understanding. I did not leave the outpost for the next 4 days. I did not complete any routes. I did not open my logbook. I did not follow any rules. I did not turn off my lights at 2200. I left the propane lamp burning all night, and I sat at the desk, and I stared at the walls, and I waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. The forest was silent. No knocking. No light. No new laminated sheets. No new entries in my logbook. The birds sang during the day. The wind moved through the canopy. The silence pressed in at night. Everything was exactly as it had been during the first week, when I had felt safe, when the rules had made sense, and that was worse. That was much worse. Because if breaking the rules produced the same result as following them, then the rules had no function. And if the rules had no function, then something else was operating, something beneath the rules, something that did not depend on my behavior at all. Something that was happening regardless. The rules were not the mechanism. The rules were the interface. The thing I was allowed to interact with, so that I would believe I had agency, so that I would believe my choices mattered, so that I would not look at the actual mechanism, which was invisible, which had been invisible the entire time, which I could not see because it was not in the forest. It was the forest. On June 15th, the supply truck came. I heard it in the early afternoon. I went outside and watched it approach on the narrow dirt road that connected my outpost to the main track. It stopped. A man got out. It was not Dahl. It was a younger man, early 30s, in a green jacket and work pants. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, "You must be the new tech." I said, "I've been here since April." He said, "Right." He unloaded 2 boxes and set them on the ground. He did not look at the forest. He did not look at the cabin. He looked at me the way you look at something you are checking on, the way you look at a gauge or a meter to see if the reading is within acceptable range. I said, "How many rules are there?" He stopped. He looked at me again, and his expression changed, and I cannot describe exactly how it changed, because it was not a change in any specific feature of his face. It was a change in the quality of his attention. He was seeing me differently. He was assessing something. He said, "You're doing fine." He got in the truck and drove away. In the box, there was no laminated sheet. There was, instead, a new logbook, identical to the one I had been using, same size, same binding, same lined pages. I opened it. It was not blank. It was filled. Every page, front to back, was covered in handwriting. My handwriting. Data entries, route logs, soil measurements, dates. The dates began on April 14th, the day I arrived, and they continued, unbroken, through October 12th. 5 months of data, complete, detailed, consistent. I had not written any of it, or I had not written it yet, or I had written it and I did not remember, or someone had written it for me, in a hand indistinguishable from my own, as a template, as a script, as a description of what I would do for the remaining 4 months of my assignment. I compared a page from the new logbook to a page from my current logbook. The handwriting was identical. The data points were different. The specific numbers varied. But the format, the abbreviations, the way I noted times, the way I drew my sample location diagrams, all of it was exactly right. Whoever or whatever had written the new logbook knew how I worked, knew the specific, personal, idiosyncratic details of how I recorded data. Either it was me, or it had studied me so closely that the distinction was meaningless. I put the new logbook in the storage locker. I sat on the step outside the cabin. The sun was beginning to drop behind the western tree line. The clearing was bathed in long, orange light. The forest was beautiful. I noticed that clearly. It was profoundly, serenely beautiful. The light on the trunks, the depth of the green, the stillness of the air. It was the kind of beauty that makes you feel small, not in a diminishing way, but in a clarifying way, like seeing the ocean for the first time. I understood something else then. The beauty was part of it too. The beauty was not incidental. It was functional. It was another rule, unwritten, unspoken, the oldest one. Stay. Be here. Look at this. Isn't it enough? I am writing this from the outpost. It is June 16th. It is 1847. The light is fading. I have not decided what I will do tomorrow. I could walk a route. I could go to the lake. I could open the new logbook and start following the script it has laid out for me, matching my actions to its pages like a performer following stage directions. I could leave. I have thought about this. I could walk to the main track and follow it south and eventually reach the administrative station, and from there the road, and from there the town. But Rule 30 says the reserve does not have boundaries, and I do not know what that means in practice. I do not know if the main track goes where I think it goes. I do not know if south is where it should be. I do not know if the administrative station exists in the same way Outpost D does not exist. There is one more thing I want to say, and then I will stop. This morning, before the supply truck came, I walked to the lake. During the day, within permitted hours, following the rules, I stood on the gravel shore and I looked at the water. It was still. It was dark. It reflected nothing, not the trees, not the sky, not me. I stood at the edge and looked down into it, and I could not see the bottom. I could not see any depth at all. The water was not transparent. It was not opaque. It was something else, something that my eyes could not parse, like looking at a surface that was simultaneously there and not there. And while I stood there, I had a thought that I believe was not my thought. It arrived fully formed, in language, the way a sentence appears on a page. It said, "You are the 43rd. I do not know what it means. I do not know if it means I am the 43rd technician assigned to Outpost C. I do not know if it means I am the 43rd person to stand in this spot and look at this water. I do not know if it means I am the 43rd version of myself to exist inside this system, running through the same season, following the same routes, finding the same notes, reading the same rules, arriving at the same understanding again and again, until whatever the system is calibrating reaches the value it is looking for. I do not know. But I think about Rule 22. If you find yourself thinking about a rule you have not been given, you have already been given it. And I think about the new logbook in the storage locker, filled with my handwriting, describing 5 months of work I have not done yet. And I think about the knocking, the invitation that can be accepted at any time and will not come again. And I wonder if the knocking has come 42 times before, and 42 times I did not open the door, and 42 times I reached this exact point, this same evening, this same fading light, and wrote this same account, and put it somewhere, and started again. I think the forest is patient. I think the season does not end. I think the rules are not for me. I think they are me. I think they are the shape I make as I move through the system, the same way a groove is the shape a needle makes as it moves through a record. The music is not in the needle. The music is in the groove, and the groove is worn a little deeper each time. Tomorrow I will walk Route 3. I will collect my samples. I will note the time. I will follow the rules I know, and I will discover rules I don't, and I will write them down, and I will be changed by them, and the forest will be quiet and green and beautiful, and the lake will be dark, and the black-barked trees will stand in the green like something counted and recounted by a mind that is not mine and is not human and is not finished. I am not afraid. That is the worst part. I should be afraid. I should be terrified. But the fear is gone, and in its place is something flatter and wider, something that feels like acceptance, but might be the 43rd repetition of acceptance, worn so smooth it doesn't even feel like a feeling anymore. The light is almost gone. I will turn off the lamp at 2200. I will lie in the dark. I will listen. And if the knocking comes, I will not open the door, because that is what I do. That is what I have always done. That is the rule I follow without being told. The rule that was never on any sheet. The rule that is me, the deepest one. The one that says, do not open the door. Do not leave. Do not stop. Do not wake up. The forest has rules. No one told me all of them. But I think now that I have always known them. I think they were in me before I arrived. I think the forest did not give me the rules. I think the forest recognized them. I think I was always here,